really isn't able to process that number of items. And corporations hire tens of thousands of people to try to get you to buy their products. Right?
So what's the way out? I read a post on your blog where you talk about zombie grocery shopping.
Yeah, that's how I go to the grocery store with a list, because when I'm sitting at home making out a list, I don't have all these alluring distractions pulling me toward them, right?
Uh-huh.
I take a list, I go into the store, and I make the mistake of going down the center aisles first, which is where they put all the bad stuff generally.
Right.
And suddenly I've got, Haagen-Dazs Karma Sutra ice cream, or Ben & Jerry's Karma Sutra ice cream. I've got Entenmann's chocolate donuts. I've got just a whole mess of things that weren't on the list.
So why is that? Because I actually have on my phone like the standard shopping list, and then I add things that I know, might be a little luxury but not big luxuries, and I go on there armed with my list. Why is it that we go to the center aisle first when we know that that's bad for us?
Because of a structural vulnerability in our brains. So the brain and the body are filled with structural vulnerabilities. And they, depending on lots of factors, some of them being our genetic heritage, some of them being the early environment we grew up in, some of them being the people that we surrounded ourselves with when we were younger or as we're older. All these things contribute to how our brain functions at any given time, right? So as far as what we can do about it, well, there's something that I have termed the prefrontal paradox.
That sounds exciting. Tell us about that.
Okay. So if you think of the brain, it's essentially pretty much the same brain that we've had when we were roaming the savannah.
Uh-huh.
It hasn't changed that. It hasn't evolved very much. But our environment really has evolved significantly. And the brain that we walk around with currently really loves novelty. In some ways, it's a novelty-seeking machine. And to accommodate that desire for novelty, the culture and businesses constantly provide us with new things to appeal to this vulnerability of our brain.
Okay.
Right?
So they know the score, and they build our environments so that we're drawn in. So the prefrontal cortex, in my work, I think about that as the executive function of the brain. Is that the part of the brain we're talking about?
That's exactly the part.
Okay.
So executive functions are part that the prefrontal cortex is able to manage when we are mindful and able to pay attention to what we want and what we're doing. The problem is we're often not. And a lot of our capacity for paying attention and having strong executive function is dependent upon how much brain wiring runs from our emotional centers to the prefrontal area of the brain. So one of the reasons why children need parents to limit and guide their food intake and many other behaviors is because they can't do it themselves.
Because their brain is, why is that? Tell us about that.
Because their brain is immature. It hasn't fully developed the wiring that it will eventually develop as long as they aren't injured or damaged by the time they're 25.
Okay, so this is fascinating, Mark. So that executive function is actually provided by the parents of these young children up until the age of in their early 20s, 25 for males, and I can't remember what it is for females, right?
It's earlier for females. Females have a earlier, fuller integration. So this is part of the vulnerability of the brain, and that is, we have these emotional draws and needs, and we don't have the internal wiring to be able to easily manage them.
Mm-hmm.
Even at my age, as a trip to the grocery store will often attest, right?
A weekly test sometimes, right?
Right. I mean, when I get home, I look at what I've bought and I say, geez, I did it again. I shouldn't be allowed to go to the grocery store by myself. I should take an adult with me.
So we're talking about how the brain is wired and how going grocery shopping is a test for the average adult, including you, Mark. And I want to kind of bring us back around to this notion of weight management and wicked problems. And you mentioned something in your work about the marshmallow test and how that connects to weight management. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So this, again, is related to executive function. And in the 70s, a psychologist at Stanford University named Walter Mischel had two children, and they were about 2 years difference in age. And he noticed that the older child was much more easily able to regulate himself and to make healthy decisions. Much more easily than the younger child. And so he thought it would be really interesting because he was an experimental psychologist, to do an experiment in Bing Nursery School over at Stanford, which is set up for people to do experiments. They have two-way mirrors and rooms that are wired for sound. And so what Mischel did was a very simple experiment. He basically brought kids into a room, and he showed them an array of goodies. There were cookies and candies and marshmallows and toys. And he had them select what they wanted. And then he said to them, I'm going to leave the room, and I'm going to leave the object you selected, in this case marshmallows, and if you can wait till I come back, then you can have two. Okay? And then he filmed these kids. And he filmed both the successful ones and the ones who couldn't resist the temptation, right? Didn't have the ability to control their impulses. And the kids who were successful developed all kinds of creative strategies. For example, just simply walking away from the marshmallow and not even paying any attention to it. Another strategy was to use their fingers to put a frame around it and imagine that it's not a real marshmallow, it's a picture of a marshmallow. And because it's a picture, you can't eat it. Another kid used an imagination to imagine it wasn't a marshmallow, it was a stinky fish. And nobody wants to eat a stinky fish. Right? So that was the gist of the experiment, and a number of kids were able to do it, but a number of kids were not. And so what Mischel did is he tracked those kids over time, and when he checked back with them, what he discovered is the kids who were able to exercise impulse control were living far happier and far more successful lives than the kids who were not. So what that suggests is that the kids that he brought in who were able to resist these temptations had much greater wiring from their emotional centers of their brain to the prefrontal area. And it's not an on or off thing. It's a matter of degree. And mostly what happens is all of us can exert some kind of impulse control. We just need to structure things in ways that will help facilitate it. An example would be what I mentioned before, me taking someone to the grocery store with me who can just say no.
Who can exercise the control that you're not able to exercise in that moment.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So the strategies that the young people used for impulse control So how does that help us think about things like, managing our weight and our, our tendency to make, New Year's resolutions, Easter resolutions, summer resolutions, all these things. We go to the gym, we buy, memberships year after year, and after a couple of times at the gym, we stop going. So what does this have to do with helping, like, the average person, like me? Like, I'm trying to lose weight right now. But I know my weak spots, so how does this work for me?
Okay, so here's what I would suggest. On the internet, I have a slideshow called the prefrontal paradox, and in that slideshow, I present exactly what it is. It's pretty much what I just described, and then ways to actually begin to grow the wiring that we need to be able to exercise that kind of control. Okay? But here's what we can do until we have it, right?
Okay.
We can begin to structure our environments so that they support us in our cognitive desire to manage weight successfully. Okay? So, for example, taking someone with me to the grocery store, or knowing when I'm most susceptible to going off a healthy regimen. And it's usually in the morning for me, for some strange reason. And changing what I do in the morning. So usually what I'll do in the morning is come into the office and I'll have some tea, and usually it'll be a donut or a muffin. So I could simply change that, where we have dogs that we use for exercise here. I could take the dogs out first thing in the morning, just so that I'm breaking the routine, right?
Okay.
So here's the key piece, and that is many of us can develop strategies to lose weight we've put on, but the real challenge is going to be to keep it off. Because studies have shown that first of all, what happens is once you put on weight, your brain and your body have changed to make it much more difficult to take off and keep off. So this is a really important and key piece that I want to emphasize, and that is, it's not our fault that we struggle with this. This is a vulnerability of our brain and body. And it's a vulnerability of the current culture we live in, because we're walking around with pretty much the same brain that we roamed the savannah with, where we used to have to go out and hunt and chase down our food. And now we just have to go over to the grocery store.
Yeah. So as you're talking, I'm picturing this like Savannah brain. I think you call it the Serengeti brain in one of your posts.
You're right. Yeah.
But I'm also picturing, this wiring that we have to grow in. And what the image that keeps coming up for me, Mark, is this, wonderful garden full of flowers and full of different kinds of flowers that I have to plant seeds for, that I have to water, so the wiring growing. But until that garden grows, I can start making changes today, like now, in how I set up my life, basically the routines in my life, the habits in my life.
And the people.
And the people, okay?
Right.
And the people in my life.
Have you ever gone on a restorative retreat?
Yes.
And usually when you go on these things, they serve you really healthy food.
Yes.
And it's not a problem, right?
Right.
You don't have to do any prep. All you have to do is sit down, eat it, and it's great. It's easy.
Yeah.
So there, and there you see the power of the environment to influence our choices. We don't have to make any. It's when we have to make the choices and the environment doesn't support us that we run into struggle.
So why is it that, when I was pregnant with my daughter, this is many, many years ago